With a provocative title like Why Christianity Must Change or Die, I expected Spong's book to be a scathing, complaining polemic against what modern Christianity had become. Also, given that Spong was still a bishop in the church and probably wanted Christianity to change rather than die, I suspected he was probably just complaining about the conservative values in Christianity, such as the prohibition of gay marriage, and probably just wanted the church to have more liberal values. I found such a message common and uninteresting, and was skeptical about how much philosophical value the book would have. To my surprise, the book was neither a polemic nor a weak appeal to tolerance. It was nothing less than an attempt to rescue Christianity by reshaping its most fundamental philosophical assumptions from the ground up. Spong's radical proposal was that we needed to reform Christianity to exist without the theistic God. The man was a living paradox. He considered himself both a passionate non-theist and a committed Christian. Spong considered himself a believer in exile. He had been trapped in the paradoxical position of no longer believing that the theistic God could exist, yet still believing that there was something profound about the experience of Christ. He was at a crossroads. He could no longer believe in Christianity as it had been traditionally expressed, yet he wanted what he felt to be the essence of Christianity to survive. He had encountered many modern Christians who had found themselves in the same situation as he. Indeed, I too found this book compelling because I was not ready to give up on Christianity completely either. There was a reason I still went to church. It was because I was convinced that, even if the theistic God did not exist, there was something special about Christianity and the Christian experience. Spong compared our current exile as believers to the Babylonian exile experienced by the Hebrews, where their temple was destroyed and Judah was overtaken by Babylon. Before this time, it was believed that the only place that God resided was in the temple in Jerusalem, and the only place the laws of the Torah could be practiced was in Judah. They believed the city of Jerusalem was supernaturally protected by God. Yet, against all their confident predictions and proclamations, the city had been destroyed. What followed was the exile. The image of God they knew, the God who lived in their temple and protected their city, had been destroyed. This God either had to grow or die. And now, Spong contended, due to the relentless march of human knowledge and awareness, the God we once knew had died as well. And as seekers of truth, we had to embrace that death. Any God who can be killed ought to be killed. As a growing human society, we saw the death of this God coming, slowly but surely. Ironically, much of this march to execution had been carried out by the very people who admired and loved this idea of God. Believing they were discovering His laws and purpose for the universe, they began intensely investigating the natural world. Our view of the natural world, the view espoused by Christian scripture, began in 3 tiers. The earth was flat, and the earth was where we lived. Beneath the earth was hell. Above the earth was the sky, and above the sky was heaven, where our holy God lived and ruled over human life. This is the world where Jesus ascended to the sky to return to God after His death. This was the world where a light from heaven surrounded Saul. Yet these world images of Hebrew and Christian scripture began to falter as the arguments and evidence supporting the idea of a round earth slowly spread from ancient Greek culture to the rest of the world. They faltered further still when Copernicus and Galileo supported and promoted the idea that the earth was not the center of the universe. The picture expanded larger still when we discovered that we lived in an expansive, enormous universe, more than 93 billion light-years in diameter. The impact of these seemingly innocuous observations on the Christian understanding of Scripture is profound. It's one thing to imagine Jesus ascending into the sky above. It is quite another to imagine Jesus rocketing off into space in some odd direction. Where is Jesus going exactly in this new universe? Is He floating around in space? Is He zipping around faster than the speed of light? Is He trying to reach the edge of the universe, or will He stop off at a black hole? Or will He just fade back into another dimension since no one on Earth can see Him anymore? If that's the case, was it all just a show? Where in the hell is Jesus going exactly when He goes up in a universe like this? What does ascending to heaven even mean in a universe like this? It doesn't make any sense. Unconsciously and insidiously, a part of our perception of the theistic God had been irrevocably destroyed. It makes no sense to have a father watching down from heaven when heaven is just the light from a star shining through a cloud formation between us and 46 billion light years of mostly empty space. Looking up into the heavens doesn't make any sense when you know what is behind the clouds. For a while yet, though, humanity could still take comfort in the fact that the theistic God was still in control of the universe. That was until scientists like Isaac Newton began to discover natural laws that revealed our universe to be predictable and deterministic. Everything we had attributed to God, from plagues to storms to healing, began to be revealed as cogs in a deterministic machine that required no God to work. At least, though, we could count on the fact that God had created us to live in this deterministic world of laws that He surely created. Creation was one act we could count on. Surely we had been created in the image of God. Yet Charles Darwin opened our eyes to a reality where we had evolved and were still evolving. Creations we did not appear to be. Rather, we appeared to be processes that rose from the clashing deterministic order and chaos of the universe. As we grasp for ways to resuscitate a dying God, we reach for quantum mechanics. Its new and tantalizing opposition to determinism seemed to create a hole through which the supernatural could re-invade our lives. Yet, the study of quantum mechanics has never borne such fruit. It has revealed nothing more than yet another strange and alienating realm, with its own cold principles that had nothing to do with our warm and loving image of God. To anyone with the education to grasp our current understanding of the natural world, the God of theism had become unemployed. The tasks assigned to this God by traditional wisdom had slowly but surely been stripped from the divine side. This God no longer had any real work to do. Every job this God was supposed to do had been replaced by something else. And as we reflected on where this God came from and why we had believed in Him at all, in that reflection, we saw ourselves. The God of Thomas Aquinas looked and acted very much like Thomas Aquinas. So too did the God of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Thomas Cranmer look and act like each of these theologians. As we reflected, we began to see, according to Spong, how we had created God in our own image. The attributes we have claimed for God are nothing but human qualities expanded beyond human limits. Human life is mortal. God is immortal. Human life is finite. God is infinite. Human life is limited in power. God is omnipotent. Human life is limited in knowledge. God is omniscient. Human life is bound to a particular space. God is omnipresent. Human life is bound by natural laws. God is supernatural. Reading Spong, I could see how the creation process for these ideas was so obvious it was childish. All we had to do was look at ourselves and see what we were not, then imagine a being that was what we were not. We had imagined a perfect human being to be in charge of this world and this universe. This image was so narcissistic. We could not handle a world where something like a human was not in charge. We could not handle a universe that was not ruled by something like us. In worshiping this image of God, we worshipped ourselves. We worshipped the idea of something like a human controlling our destiny, just as we exercise control on the world around us. Spong had also revealed to me an ecclesiastical world that I never knew existed before. It was a world where priests and bishops who examined their faith realized its inadequacy, where pastors and nuns lived a life in secret where they doubted the very words they preached. How many church leaders in my life had secretly doubted the very existence of God? My eyes had suddenly been opened to the possibility. If I had discovered the problems with my faith through reflection and study, why wouldn't many clergy members? It made so much sense now, and it filled me with hope. What was most fascinating about Spong was that instead of abandoning Christianity to theism, he was trying to rescue Christianity from it. Despite the fact that theism was clearly inadequate, he emphasized that he still felt the Christian experience was profound and useful. He argued that there was no reason to allow the current images of Christ, which had been fully authored in creeds from the 5th century, to dictate how we interpreted the Christ experience in the modern age. There was no reason to think that the people on these councils 1500 years ago had any more authority to dictate what Christ meant to us than we did. Spong made his argument for a new image of Jesus based on the earliest Christian scriptures, the letters of the Apostle Paul, starting with the earliest Pauline letter, 1 Thessalonians. I was very surprised to learn that these were the earliest Christian scriptures, but it made sense. Paul never spoke of anything in the Gospels except for Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. He never showed any awareness of any of the extravagant stories and miracles. These stories in the Gospels seem to have been extrapolated and invented from the ideas of Paul himself. From Mark to Matthew to Luke, the supernatural claims got bigger and bigger. Like a big fish story, the fish got bigger with every telling. But Paul's own image of Jesus, the first image of Jesus, was much more modest, realistic, and focused. Spong argued that Paul and the other early Christians had encountered something in the Christ experience that changed them. The story of Christ was someone who lived fully and loved wastefully, who expanded beyond the provincial limits of his society. He broke barriers that, for their culture, had never been broken before. He accepted children, Gentiles, criminals, and tax collectors. Christ had expanded the boundaries of their compassion and fullness of life in a way that they had never experienced before. And this expansion of compassion and fullness was real, even if the language of theism early Christians used to explain it was not. And I could admire this about Spong's perspective on Jesus. After encountering people like Robert Ingersoll, the professor, and even Spong himself, I was no longer convinced that Jesus was the pinnacle of human existence. These people had revealed things to me I had never learned from the words of Jesus. But in the context of his time, I could see how Jesus, or at least the idea of Jesus, was revolutionary. Because Jesus was an example of someone who not only stood against the ignorance of his time, but gave people something positive to reach for beyond it. Spong was helping me reevaluate my Christian experience and extract from it the things that were still important to me. One thing I still sought desperately to understand was prayer in a non-theistic world. Prayer was an experience that I still looked back on as being valuable to me in some way, even though I no longer believed a theistic God had been listening. I read through Spong's chapter on prayer in earnest, trying to learn how prayer could still be meaningful if there was no one there to pray to. Spong's answer was that the way to pray in a world with no theistic God was to connect with the life of the universe itself. For example, he had replaced the time that he had once spent praying with solitary study and reflection. The point was to embrace this life in the eternal now and experience it fully and completely. At first I found his answer disappointing, because it seemed that his answer was basically that there was no way to pray. But eventually I embraced this way of thinking, and changed my focus from trying to find a way to pray to embracing the moment I live in now. One of the most intense focal points of Spong's exposition was finding a new way of understanding God without theism. He saw God as the ground of all being. It was this conception of God that he used to explain the attitudes of Jesus, saying that the example of Jesus called us to be all we could be, living fully, loving wastefully, with no expectation of reward. I found this conception of God as the very grounding of our existence very compelling at the time. It was quite compatible with the stance of pantheism that I had developed at my deconversion and expanded through reading and embracing Jonathan Livingston Seagull. But I was still confused about God, and what exactly, if theism was invalid, God really was. And with this driving curiosity as my impetus, I moved on to a book that was all about God, A History of God, by Karen Armstrong.